Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us once again. I want to introduce today the people that we have that will be facilitating the book club. So firstly, I'd like to introduce Kevin Glass. Every time I speak to Kevin, he leaves me with lots of thoughts and lots of things to think about. He's a real change maker, and all the things that he shares with me about his school. He's the head of International School Atlanta. It is always nothing short of fascinating. And if I can, please do look on their website. They have a wonderful diversity and inclusion page. It really does give you that warm, fuzzy feeling. I'd like to also introduce Jeff Bradley from NEASC. So we're running our leadership conference jointly with NEASC, and Jeff's the director there. So we've been talking probably for the past year about lots of things surrounding education and how we feel things could change and improve. So again, he's just one of my favorite people to talk to. And finally, but by no means least, we've got Kyra with us, Kyra Kellwell. Kyra does lots of things, so I can't really, I don't know what to introduce her as. She's a real change maker. And ECIS, I don't know if you all know, we did a leadership conference on belonging and diversity. So what Kyra did was helped us put our ideas into some sort of order and to be able to share them. She also created some resources for us at ECIS so we can share with our community. And we'll forever be grateful to you, Kyra, for all the work you've done and how you've helped us frame our ideas and share them with the community. So I hope you've all read the book, Empire Land by Satnam Sanghera. So just to give you a little bit of a background, I read his first book in 2017. And when I was reading it, I felt like it was my own social history. So I grew up at exactly the same time in exactly the same town with all very similar experiences. I was just telling the panel earlier, I could walk from my house to exactly where he lived very quickly. And I knew all the shops he talked about. And when he talked about Enoch Powell and the bus drivers, my dad was one of those bus drivers. So I always feel very connected to him. And when Empire Land was published earlier this year, I was compelled to read it. One of the other reasons was my son has been in Bristol University studying, and he was asked to go, you know, when those protests happened. So it feels like it's part of my own life. So I'm going to hand over to Kyra, who's going to share some questions with us, and then we can all talk together.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Cam, and thanks for the intros to everybody who's joining us. And I'd love to ask the attendees here to just let us know a bit more about themselves, maybe quickly, and if you're happy to speak, just say where you're calling in from, and also if you enjoyed the book or not. Maybe a quick sort of like thumbs up, thumbs down, middling would be good to know. I've also posted the first question I'm going to ask of Kevin and Jeff and of course Cam, but I'm happy to hear from all of you. I think we should run this like a real book group so that we can all hear a little bit from each other. So I don't know if you're happy to share anything about where you're calling in from today, and also what you thought of the book, Rama or Sahar or Fernandez. Take it away if you are. If you're not, I will fill the silence. Don't worry.
I'm Rama. I'm actually representing ALOC. Kevin.
Great.
ALOC.
Awesome. Nice to see you. Welcome.
Thank you. I've been excited to come to this book club. I'm still at school right now, but I came to Dhaka about a month ago now. And right when Kevin asked me if I could be a part of this, I was like, yeah, that's great. Yeah, I'll get the book online. The book is not online. So I'm still waiting for the book to come. So, but I still wanted to come today and kind of listen, and hopefully I'll get the book next time we meet again, if we meet again. But I'm very excited about this book because my husband is from Scotland. He's from the UK, and often we hear, when we go to the UK, we hear people talking about anti-racism through the American context. And I thought this book would be such a great book to read, to kind of show that actually racism is a global issue, and that imperialism affects all of us ultimately. and that it's all of our responsibility to find a way to dismantle all of it. So I'm very excited that finally we have a perspective that is not American centric, so we can really start talking about why this is a global problem. So thank you.
Wow, yeah, absolutely. And you know what you say, thank you, Rama, what you say just chimes in with what we were just talking about before we opened up the call, because the book is not easy to find everywhere. And we wondered about why that was. We wondered about whether that was uncomfortable, given the twinning of the history and the, you know, the overlap of histories between North America and the UK. And we were thinking about, you know, why is it not more widely read, or why is it not more available? So that's an interesting question to raise. And we're just glad that you're here, because I hope it will make your reading different when you do get hold of it. So would anyone else like to step in and just say hi and see how they found the book, if they've read it, or if not, or just say hello to the book group? I see Claire's just joined us.
Yeah, Claire's just joined us. And today, Claire and I had a conversation this morning, very early this morning, about the fact that you wanted to do some work around decolonization at the school, didn't you, Claire? You're on mute, I think, Claire.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yes, I did. And I haven't read the book, I apologise, but I thought I'm going to join the group anyway, because I want to hear what everyone's got to say. But absolutely, I think we have to decolonise the curriculum. We have to be more inclusive and rewrite history correctly. So it's something in every subject. I mean, we're primary, so we're cross-curricular, but secondary too, you want to see every subject correctly represented.
Thank you, Claire.
Well, for those of us who have read it, maybe we can start by thinking through the question about the first question I've posted there, and all of us can think about this. Once you know what the history is that's being retold in this book, Satnam has said that he wrote this as an idiot's guide to empire, the idiot being me, after not receiving any formal education on the British Empire during the whole of his school life, which I can attest to as somebody who went to a sort of regular comprehensive school in the UK for secondary. Speaking to dozens of graduates of the world's best universities, when he went to one of them, he said there was a similar lived experience. So I'm wondering how many of our panel, or how many of our guests here today, have ever studied or known about any of the historical events mentioned in the book in any detail, and whether you felt your own education was lacking in this area as well. I can certainly start off by saying I know mine was. Kevin, maybe we can start with you.
Yeah, so just for the folks on the call, thank you, Kyra. I'm originally from the northeast of England, Newcastle. I'm a Geordie man. My dad was a coal miner, working class area. Went to a state comprehensive school. And interestingly enough, it was sort of 1979 to 1986 that I was in secondary school. We did have some excellent history teachers in the school. And my recollection of learning about Britain and its role in the world was a pretty horrific one. And they were unvarnished in their sharing of events and facts and the evils of colonialism. And so I actually think through that sense, at the time, I probably had a more enlightened view of history at a state comprehensive in the northeast of England than most folks of my gender, of my race. Probably did.
Why do you think that was? Do you think that was?
Yeah, it was before. It was before. I'm dating myself now, right? It was before the complete standardization of the British national curriculum and the launch of all of those key stage and all of those kinds of things, when local education authorities still had discretion and freedom to a large extent in terms of their curricular choices, also in terms of which examination authority they would be working at in the UK. So the English, at least the English education system at the time, there was a great deal more teacher discretion and local education authority discretion into the curriculum. That was the time before all of that Key Stage 1, the national standardized testing movement, and all of those things came on board. It didn't really sink into me. white Anglo-Saxon, Protestant school, working class. The extent of diversity in my school was that we had 2 Catholic families who chose to send their kids there rather than sending them to the local Catholic school. So that it didn't really sink in or touch me personally until I started living and working overseas. Age 23, I moved to Southern Africa, and age 27, moved to West Africa. And then it really began to touch me, and I began to feel it at a deep personal level, and felt at the time in my 20s immense amounts of shame and wanting to fix things and wanting to make it right. I'm not an expert on the UK national curriculum. I've been out of the country since I was 23 years old, so I could not comment, Kyra, on how history is taught in the UK anymore. I will tell you that we use a wonderful website here called Facing History, which is absolutely phenomenal. And we try here to use primary source documentation from all sides of an issue. So for example, the Iranian embassy siege in London, the kids will look at Iranian from the time newspaper headlines and news articles, and UK at the time newspaper headlines and articles, and then come to their own conclusion and draw their own conclusions and justify their own conclusions based on those primary source documentation. And so a deliberate and systemic attempt to remove that sort of whitewashing of history is underway, and it's not me doing this. It's our teachers here are really dedicated to this. So I'll stop because I recognize Jeff needs to speak also. Forgive me.
Thanks. No, we're going to get to the next point about how we decolonize our own curriculum, and I think you'll have plenty to share on that front. Yeah, Jeff, how did you find the book?
I love the book, and it fits well with a lot of reading that I've done lately, where I'm really educating myself about so much of this. By the way, I'm sorry if there's some background noise here. I am outside on a college campus here, the best spot for me. And thanks again for having me be part of this. So yeah, this book, and I've said this to Cam, fits so well with a lot of other reading that I've been doing really since before the pandemic, because the work that we do at the New England Association of Schools and Colleges is, it's affirmation and it's validation of what's going on in school, broadly speaking. I was a philosophy major in college too, so I like to ask questions like why and how come and what for. So the question that I've been asking is, what's our role in validating schools and practices in schools that we may not fully agree with? And it's a big question for us because, we have a lot of standards and principles that we lay out there for schools, and they don't cover everything imaginable. So, but we do have, strict, I would say fairly strict guidelines, particularly at the early stage when a new school is applying, where we, scrutinize the school. So I see the role, not just my role personally, but our organization's role as significant when we're talking about what should be happening inside schools. Now, this question of what did I learn? I just give you a quick little bio here. I grew up here in New Hampshire, which is one of the original 13 colonies of America. My state, New Hampshire, borders at the very northern edge, Canada. And as a child, my first international trip was to Canada to play hockey. And we traveled to Montreal. And I remember, wondering, why is it that we're in one neighborhood where they speak French, and in the other neighborhood they speak English. And we were in Quebec, which is mostly French speaking, but there was a lot of bilingual, bicultural people there. So that was the beginning of my understanding. How is it that they're French and in my state, we have a lot of French Canadians whose ancestors came down from Canada, and they have French, French sounding names. So I was an early curious about how is it that we have this right on our border, this English-French thing going on. And I loved languages. I went through state school, public school in New Hampshire, and then went off to Washington, D.C. for college and grad school. And that's where I began my teaching career. And then my international experience started in terms of working.
Oh, we seem to have lost your sound. I don't know if it's just me.
Yeah, we lost your sound, Jeff.
Maybe his headphones have been
There we
unplugged
go.
somehow. Oh, you're back. You're back. You're back.
Yeah, sorry, a phone call came in.
No worries.
So school year abroad, Italy. And that was when I began learning more and more about international schools. And then later I moved to the American school in Switzerland, where I was head of school and part of the school, the network of international schools. And so one question that I had early on, and I think this book helps move me toward a better answer, and then I'll stop and invite others' comments. I wondered, why are so many international schools British curriculum, British based? Why, when I go to conferences, aren't there more non-British people representing international schools? Whether American or Canadian or whatever. And in this book, if you think about the history of Britain's influence globally, it not suddenly, but gradually begins to make sense. Why do countries right away recognize and authorize a school with a British curriculum, but then maybe scratch their head a little bit when the school says, well, we're going to offer an American curriculum and an American diploma, which is not as standardized as what as Kevin was describing, the key stage and A levels and all that. We don't quite do it that way, partly because our 13 colonies were all independent and K-12 education was in the hands of the local authorities, and still is to this day. It's part of that sloppiness that is America and our democracy in America. So this book is the beginning, or maybe the continuation of that answer to me of why is there such British influence all around the world, for good or ill. And I'll leave it there.
Oh yeah, that's a great point. Great point. And yeah, working at a British school, I'm feeling my ears kind of burning, because you're absolutely right. Does anyone else want to just say hi? I know we have some new people joining in. Tell us what you thought of the book if you've read it, or even if you just read little parts, if you couldn't read the whole book. We'd love to hear your opinions on how you found it, and whether you were able to access it as well, because that was a question that came up. Anyone who wants to step in, feel free to do so.
For me, the book was quite a difficult read. I almost had to galvanize myself before I read it. When I first started reading it, day one, I got to page 26, and it says that routine employment discrimination stemmed from imperialism. Mm-hmm. So in Wolverhampton, the first Indian teacher was appointed in 1978. So by this point, I was already in school dreaming about being a teacher, but not realizing I probably couldn't be one. Well, I couldn't be one then anyway, because I was only 7 years old. But not only, so the teacher was appointed in 1978, but the board members decided they didn't want a teacher of colour at the school, and they took his employment contract back. Mm-hmm. That wasn't that long ago, was it?
That was mad to read that, because my dad was teaching in London schools in the early 70s, mid 70s. So I can only imagine the discrimination he would have. He was from Trinidad and Tobago. And yeah, it's just mad, isn't it? It's so recent, the history.
Yeah. And I must have just been a couple of years behind Kevin in school, because I didn't get that history that you were talking about. It was already a different history that was being taught in schools.
Yeah, we're going to move, I think, probably to the question that I think is on everybody's lips in terms of our panelists, and I hope that the educators here will also be thinking about their own contexts. How have you found the decolonize the curriculum, call for action, let's call it, gaining weight in your communities, gaining respect, gaining momentum? And of course, with the history that's been explained in this book, how have you found that the reading of this has helped you respond to these calls? And did this book make you consider your own students' learning experiences any differently? anyone can take that, whoever wants to go for it.
Yeah, I can start us off. You know, I actually liked what he came back to, I think, in his last chapter, in terms of building off and adding to and bringing in these other perspectives and these other points of view. So he suggested that, and I've made some notes here, campaigners have probably got a better chance of succeeding if they talk about widening and broadening the curriculum and bringing in all of these alternate perspectives, as opposed to just going solely down the lens of decolonizing the curriculum. That resonated with me, because again, that philosophy of looking at each situation and each event, each thing that was going on through as many possible lenses and perspectives as possible helps each young person develop their own understanding. And that's our role, right, as guides and facilitators of the growth of the young human being. And the decolonizing piece resonates with me more in terms of our industry. Jeff, to come back to your point, I mean, I think we all just have to face up to the fact that international education is neocolonialism writ large on a global scale, catering to a tiny, tiny global elite through the lens principally of an Anglo-American, truly Eurocentric worldview. And it's our industry that needs to decolonize itself as an industry. I do believe that many of our educators are beginning on this journey and are bringing in a multitude of perspectives into their, let's say, their history classrooms, right? But we as an industry, and anyone who's got any kind of influence or leadership in our industry, we just have to confront this brutal truth that we have to decolonize our industry.
Yes, yes, yes. I could see a lot of people nodding while you were speaking.
You know, one of the things I'll say, if I may, in response, Kevin, or to really to add to what you're saying. First of all, I had the same passage. It's the last page of the book, isn't it? If campaigners talked about widening curriculums rather than decolonizing them, which I think is a provocative challenge. You know, to just feed a little bit off what you said there about this, the very fabric of this network of international schools is neocolonial in nature, neocolonialism writ large, which in the sense that these schools didn't cater to all the people in the colony. It catered, as international schools still do to this day, to an elite audience. If it's the local kids that are attending, it's probably not universally, but it's probably the families with means. If it's the expat, we know, that's a real blend. How do our international schools treat the local students that are in their midst? And really post 2008, more and more of our international schools saw a shift away from the expat populations to the local population. And let me just add another issue, which is a major issue for many international schools, probably not for Atlanta, Kevin, for obvious reasons, and that is the pay scale and the compensation of the expats versus the locals. And there are valid reasons to say, well, no, they're not going to be paid the same for all kinds of reasons. But I think that question is one that we need to continue to ask ourselves. And if we're serious about decolonizing, we have to really understand, how did we get to where we are with the exclusive nature of these schools? Because every time a school says, well, we're going to be inclusive, they ignore, or tend to ignore, that the DNA that shaped who they are is exclusive in nature. By definition, these are exclusive schools. Elite schools, you might say. Well, exclusive is the opposite of inclusive. So as we talk about inclusion, we always have to say, okay, but let's take a breath and look back and say, is that possible? What do we have to do to be serious about inclusion, knowing where our school came from and kind of out of what fabric it was cut and shaped?
Claire, did you have something to add?
I did. Sorry, I just put a crisp in my mouth. That was great timing. what I wanted to say, and I don't mean it to sound like I'm sucking up, but for me, I thought it was really important when ECIS decided to have a conference dedicated to DEI. And for an organization that's actually working with so many international schools, I think that's really important because it shows a commitment, and it encourages all those schools to work with something different. It was an unusual step for an entire leadership conference to be focused on that aspect, and that work to continue as well. So I think that's really important. The other point I wanted to make was really that when we're looking at the curriculum, it's also what teachers know. You know, we teach what we think we understand and what we know, and we teach what we were taught at school. We teach what the media shows us and what we hear. And I did an exercise in a webinar I did once. I feel I've invented it, but probably other people have done it too. But a bit like the Draw Scientist, I've done Google Africa and see what comes up. Google Europe and see what comes up, looking at the images that you get, or Google just simple things like school in Africa or housing, and you get such a biased negative perspective when you look at these areas. But one of the things I found really interesting, I asked people to put up words as they did this Google search, and one colleague put up the word truth. And I found that really interesting because that particular colleague, what she saw in those images was what she thought was the truth. You saw poverty in Africa, you saw housing that was really, the words I don't like as well, like mud hut or shack or shanty town, all pejorative. But to her, that was the truth. That was the reality that she saw probably in the media, maybe even in textbooks, maybe even if she's been as a tourist to those areas, because you kind of get wheeled along to these areas. So it's also starting with educating our staff, because they might not know. You know, they're representing what they think is perhaps inclusive. They think they are including and being diverse by putting forward these negative views. So I think we have to start first by actually deconstructing, if you like, what people think they know already before we go for the curriculum, because people can be almost tokenistic, thinking they're doing a good thing and thinking they're being inclusive. So it's actually stripping everything away before we even begin to look at where we go with the curriculum, in case we get that bit wrong as well.
Can I jump in on that point, Claire, about how you were saying, you know, we go back to default behaviors, we go back to teaching the way we were taught, or but also, of course, with a significant number of people here speaking with British accents, I think one of the things that really comes through here in Satnam Sanghera's fascinating historical writing here is that he's very clear about that he's not a historian. He's just somebody who, you know, is an extraordinarily intelligent man who happens to be a journalist, and his research is extraordinarily thorough. But he explores those areas of nostalgia which are extraordinarily British. They belong to other cultures as well, but the nostalgia and the amnesia. And it is difficult to be working within a curriculum framework if we haven't faced that ugly fact about ourselves, that we are representing ways of behaving that are very much born of a cultural background. And so from that amnesia and from that nostalgia, you know, he goes on to explore exceptionalism and multiculturalism being a two sides of a sword, and then the elitism, and so, you know, just speaking to those points that Jeff was making about our exclusive school environments, we tend then to start thinking that we're doing people a favor by teaching in a particular way, or that we have that imperialistic attitude of bringing civilization to the world, and haven't yet seen the ugly face of that, because we're so used to that default belief that we're doing something good for other people. This is a huge dilemma. I was fascinated by his statement about the fact that because he talked about our country and my heritage, he got hate letters because people were saying, how can you use that pronoun when you're actually I mean, the guy was born in Great Britain to parents who had British passports, but that's still part of our default thinking, and we have to be careful of that in international schools.
Sarah, so true. You were just talking about the collective amnesia part, and it leads to my next question about how we make amends in our educational settings for, the kind of wrongs, even though we can't correct history, we can't teach history differently from how we learned it. We can teach history differently from how we learned it, although we can't right the wrongs of how we learned it. But it's also like, really, really telling that this book received the author received lots of negativity for writing it, and that, there are such horrific passages, for those of you who haven't read it, there are some really graphic descriptions of, horrible slave owning practices, things that just really kind of make your skin crawl when you're reading about them, things that we haven't dealt with collectively as a nation in our own history, because, as you said, Sarah, we've been too concerned with representing the face of Britain abroad. And yet there's so much in our own history that we haven't really come to terms with and dealt with, and it's a very uncomfortable subject. So, the kind of imperialist attitude is to cover it over and not teach it. So how do we make those amends? What can we start with? And does anybody here have examples of good curricular practice that they've seen embedded in their own schools, or that they feel are needed? Where would you start?
I think what Claire has invented, the Googling certain words, I think that's really powerful. So I don't know, I think I've shared with most of you, I lectured in maths and business, but actually I would bring different things into the classroom. So when Barack Obama was made president, we played through the department his inauguration speech. So it's about actually giving your students access to more material. It's no longer a thing where the teacher has all the answers and we impart that knowledge. I think it's about wider reading for the students. And, lots of people have had trouble getting this book. And actually, it's not in many bookshops, even in the UK. It's in Amazon. Waterstones are the only bookshop that are selling it. It's not at WH Smith's. So things like this aren't widely enough available. That's one of the things. And then, as even a maths teacher, I would take different things into the class and talk to them about it in that opening bit before we did do our equations and, the really important work. But it's about that, isn't it? It's about bringing in different ideas and saying Google a word and say, well, what do you all think that's a real representation?
I mean, imagine if we Googled Britain and some of the stories of what our slave owning, the great and the good of the British East India Company, and their pillaging and their looting came up as some of the first responses. What would we think about our own history then? And Sarah's point about Germany facing their own history and that being a model, I think that's actually mentioned in the book at some point.
It is, yeah. It is, and my wife is from Munich, Germany, a white female German from Bavaria, and we've had multiple. I actually read this piece out to her when I was reading the book. So, in her education system, growing up again, like me in the 80s in Munich, every aspect of their curriculum would draw lessons from and comparisons to Germany in the 1930s and 40s. And learnings from and how to avoid potentially repeating the mistakes and horrors of the past. And her school system had a partnership with kibbutzes across Israel. And so her and a whole bunch of her friends went and lived and worked on a kibbutz in Israel as part of her education, right? And again, different from the education that I received in the UK. And there's something growing up in the northeast of England, you never aired your dirty laundry in public, right? You always had to make the best of it and never talk about something that was uncomfortable or difficult. And so growing up as a young person in the UK where I grew up, I had no words, no vocabulary, no mechanism to actually approach any of these conversations in any way, shape, or form. And what we're able to do now is give our young people that voice, that agency, the tools to be able to have those difficult and uncomfortable conversations with each other, and to do so well and empathically and leading with curiosity and empathy and suspending that judgment. We can give them all of the things that my generation, and I'll put out there, I'm in my 50s, right? We were emotionally, psychologically, socially stunted and completely unable to talk about this stuff. We just couldn't do it.
If I can add to that too.
Please do.
Go ahead.
No, please do. I was saying, go ahead. You.
Oh, please do. Okay, sorry. So on page 208, it says, and he's getting toward the end here, I hope this book has demonstrated how the British Empire is absolutely embedded within us and how there are many more serious and troubling imperial legacies. That line strikes me because to have British Empire embedded within us, so it's not just embedded in our systems, like how we organize, labor and the train system in India or whatever, but inside us, which means addressing it, getting rid of it, dealing with it is complex work. And I would add to what Kevin's saying that those are the kinds of conversations we need to have in our schools, but echoing too an earlier comment about the teachers need to be equipped to help with those conversations. And they, chances are, did not receive very much education in this area or training in how to manage these difficult conversations. And I follow various podcasts, and one is I was listening to recently where the teachers were just saying, well, no, we stay away from talking about January 6th. We talked about it on January 7th, the assault on the Capitol in Washington, but now it's just become so political that we just steer clear of it. What a tragedy. Now, what else is embedded within us in the States, is the system of slavery, the caste system that we have here. What we've begun to do, obviously, and largely prompted by the Black Lives Matter movement, is remove, it's been happening, but removing some of the statues, which are the most obvious expression of this perverted view of the world. So we shouldn't put these people like Robert E. Lee on a pedestal. They were they were traitors in their own country trying to break away. And then that era, which is going back about 100 years ago when many of these statues were erected, was toward the end of the lifetime of many of the Civil War Confederate heroes, and there was this surge of Confederate patriotism that led to the erection of so many of these statues in the early 1900s, well after the war, 50 years after the war, because those 30-year-olds in the war were now 80 and dying. So here's how we honor them. And I'm glad that we've said, including in many of the states in the Deep South, that we're not going to celebrate those people anymore. That's one very small step. I think it's still largely embedded within us, but at least we can get rid of the statues, and it's a good starting point.
Yes, absolutely. And there's been some great resources shared in the chat. I want to thank all of you for what you're sharing. Even if you don't want to comment, on camera, there's some really, really awesome resources there that you can use or take away with you. We've been publishing Learning for Justice resources on the DEIJ web pages. Thank you for the IIRP links, Kevin, and of course the IDI inventory. Plenty of good stuff there. Yeah.
One more thing I want to add, because I think there's a fairly direct parallel between how imperialism is embedded within us and the notion of how we do school is embedded within us. So when you try to change, let's shift over to the conversation about school, try to change systems of schooling, try to change the idea that you need a classroom of students sitting with an adult in the room teaching. That's embedded within us, and our teachers and our administrators and our parents, for the most part, board members included, have by and large a view that that's what school is. So that's embedded within them as well. So as we look at shifting the dynamic in a school and saying, well, let's make it project-based and let's not require this subject that traditionally we have required. And let's realize that algebra is not for everybody, but statistics and data analysis probably is. And yet these things are embedded within us. Like, we wouldn't ever think of dropping algebra in our school, would we? It's just part of us. And I say, no, we need to question even that in 2021. You know, those elements of curriculum and those elements of how school works, including the grading systems, and understand why we have those grading systems. And the fact that the standardized tests have been disrupted by the pandemic, I see as a huge opportunity. The question is, will we seize the opportunity and recognize that maybe there are other ways of recognizing the learning that students have done and still assisting in the transition out of our secondary schools into universities, so that we don't make it impossible for students or more difficult for students to transition. We just make that last year or those last months of schooling for students a little more focused on well-being and celebration of learning, and not shutting themselves in a room and getting sick trying to study so that they can get a certain number score on a standardized test. And I've shared this before with you, Cam, I know.
Yeah. We have a whole other book group on this topic, I think.
I think we need to have another book group on this topic, because Jeff and I often share this, but how do we get every stakeholder to agree that's the right thing to do? Because really, when we talk, we know that's the right thing to do. But, you know, how do we stop the parents saying they must? You know, I described some schools here in the UK. They are A and A star sausage factories. They will cancel PE lessons, but to make sure the kids come out with those grades so they can go to, you know, Durham and all those types of Oxford, Cambridge type of universities. So yeah, and it's something we'll be talking a lot about at the ECIS Leadership Conference, the refocus and the rethinking.
Very good, very good. And maybe we can talk about, you know, inequalities that are exacerbated by standardized testing in that same next book group. But I would love to thank everybody. I know we're going to be breaking soon. If there are any other questions or comments from any other guests, we would love to have them. And while you're thinking about what you'd like to say, I'd like to also ask you if there are any books that you would like us to take forward into the next edition of this. So that's pretty typical. At the end of the book group, we can have a vote. People can put their ideas in. So if you've read something recently that really got you fired up and you'd like to discuss it, please let us know, either in the chat or with an email to deij@ecis.org, and we can put it on the list, and we'll make sure that we get we get you in for that. It looked like Rama might have something to say. I'm gonna see if she did, or if I imagined it.
I think Claire had her hand up as well.
Yes, all right. Is Rama contributing?
Go for it, Claire, in the meantime.
Okay, actually, it was a random thought I thought I'd add. When we talk about the British history, if you like, and colonialisation, I did some of my formative education. I was all over the place, all over the world for education, but I did a lot of my secondary education in Scotland, and I think what I was taught in Scotland was a very different history to what was taught in England. So when we talk about the UK or British history, if any of you have watched, I've forgotten what it's called now, Reign, the one with Mary Queen of Scots, I was taught a completely different history about the Battle of Culloden and all the Scots, and that Mary Queen of Scots was the true queen, and Bonnie Prince Charlie. So I think it sets you up for knowing that history is, as one of my favorite Rasta friends says, one man's story, his story. Because my history, even in that UK curriculum, was a very different version. When I moved to England for A levels, it was like, oh, that's not how it happened. It happened a different way. So it's one perspective. And I think when we're looking at our curriculum, that's what Kevin said, when you're looking at history from different perspectives, that it's a really interesting way in. And now when I work in Luxembourg, I never knew until I came here that I hadn't come across many German colleagues. So yes, now I'm very much aware of how Germans see their own history, because that's never taught in UK. And of course, we're teaching so many different people who have different perspectives that we probably need to be very sensitive about how we present any history, because we're having multiple groups of people who will have different viewpoints. So in a way, it should be easier for us because we can easily see different points of view. Anyway, just a thought.
If you don't mind my jumping in, wow, thank you. What a great conversation. I'm a third grade teacher. I teach with 8 and 9-year-olds who I think are the best humans because they're so open-minded. And as I listen to everything you say, it's very interesting because the past couple of years, I started doing lessons on bias and stereotype with my third graders with social stories. So for example, you have a turtle who comes in who's new, and the rabbit comes and touches her shell. What would you do? What is she supposed to do, right? Just touching people without their permission. And just looking at what it means to be compassionate towards one another starts early on. And one of the issues that I've been having is that I actually recently told one of my leaders that I was going to do this lesson, and how much it shifted the kids' minds once they understood that their brain, when they went on automatic modes, when they didn't think, like 2 + 2 is 4, right? That's when you don't really think, but you have a system 2 in your brain where you take time and think and reflect. And that's when you really can show your compassion towards one another. So when I explained that to one of my leader, that I was going to do this lesson on bias and stereotype, their response was, "Ooh, that sounds negative." And I said, "No, that's actually self-awareness." And having self-awareness for 8-year-olds when they're understanding who they are is the perfect time to do it. So then when they get to high school, when they face history, when they listen to stories, they can actually say, well, wait a minute, I see a bias in this newspaper, or I see a bias in this story. So this is not really a question, this is more for the panel, kind of how do we, if even our leaders in our schools don't even believe in what we are doing, and that the way we include, the way we implement inclusion, how is that going to trickle down to our teachers and our students? I can do it in my classroom, but I have no control over what happens outside of my classroom. And I think it's really interesting when leaders are uncomfortable with even talking about bias and stereotypes, or even self-reflecting on their own internalized racism. It's difficult to move forward because then it becomes performative. And I see that often in international schools. And it's rather unfortunate.
Rama, I completely agree with you, and thank you for ELOC. I'm part of the Whiteness Accountability Group, and it's been transformative for me. And you know, the sad fact in our industry is the bulk of our school leaders in international education are white and they are male. I mean, that's just an absolute fact. And so it has to begin with them, and we as white males have to challenge each other's biases. And so I'll post a link to a fabulous resource from one of our ELOC things. This is Patterns of White Deflection. And please do feel free to share this with your white leader colleagues and tell them that Kevin Glass recommended this to them. All right, so I'm more than happy to take, and if you want me to follow up with white leaders, I will happily do so and book a Zoom call and book a chat, because once you start uncovering your own unconscious biases, you can't stop, right? I had no idea that there were so many dimensions of things that I could be biased about. And it's the most fantastic peeling away of lenses, right? And so in terms of self-growth as a human, once you start on this journey, you can't put that genie back in the bottle, right? You just can't.
No.
Mm-hmm.
I completely agree with Kevin. Such brilliant ideas. And when I was in the classroom, Ramo, if I felt something was right, I used to do it anyway. I know that's a little bit controversial. And I think people like you are the influencers and the change makers in schools. The heads are never going to be that, because they don't have your view and your vision. It got me into trouble sometimes, but we're not going to talk about that. But I don't mind being in trouble for stuff that I believe in. And it's just like Kevin, I've never been able to get that genie back in the bottle, you know, and it's fine. Just do what's right. And actually, if you're making those children be better adults and make the world a better place, tick, tick, tick all the way down. And if he hasn't got the vision, he's got to get on the page at some point. And we'll send him to Kevin, in fact.
Should we offer him a special rate to the next conference?
We're going to fill up detention with Kevin. So please report back to me any misdemeanors and it'll be detention.
No, but in all seriousness, you know, it's often really, really, really difficult. And so I can have a conversation with a white male colleague, that, let's say, a female colleague or a colleague from a different culture or different skin color would not be able to do. And it's on us to have those conversations, not on you.
Thank you, Kevin. So, Kevin, I will be following up on that, because we want to bring everyone together. And I say this all the time, with kindness and understanding. And if you're the man for the job. I can't thank you all enough for joining us today and having this wonderful, you know, sharing of thoughts and ideas and feelings. And this will continue. So please do join us again. And thank you for joining so late for those of you that are in Europe.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you all. And can we have a little bit longer than an hour next time? It's just too short.
Certainly, Kevin.
Noted.
What we'll be doing is, if you all come to the conference, you can have all day for 3 days.
Set a conference read, set a pre-conference read.
And Kevin's there, so you can all, you know, speak with Kevin and keep finding him.
Did we take a vote? We only have 2 books on the list as far as I can see. So did we take a vote? Do people want to do that on Twitter? How do you want to do it, Cam?
Should we follow up with this and people can suggest, and we'll ask other people who I know registered, but probably because it's September and schools are very busy. Let's do a poll and then we'll do it that way. Okay, we'll stick a poll on Twitter. If you're not already following us at UCIS_DEIJ, please do. And we'll post a Twitter poll about the next read. Thank you all so much for making the time to join us. It was a great conversation. I'm really happy that this first one went so well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really
Take
interesting.
care, everybody.
Thanks very much indeed.
Bye.
Bye now.
Thank you, Kevin.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Cam. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.